I'm pretty thrilled to be here in Houston. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Austin, Texas, lived in Los Angeles, lived and worked in Los Angeles for 6 years, and that's when I first began my work in the public sphere. So when I was living and working in Los Angeles, I co-organized the art collective Yarn Bombing LA. We were a collective of 20 to 50 knitters and crocheters across the city who used fiber art as a form of public art and public intervention. So this is the piece that we are most known for. It was in 2013, I believe. We covered the 3-story facade of the Craft and Folk Art Museum on Wilshire Boulevard with crowdsourced granny squares to talk about its identity as the cute craft museum across from LACMA. And these granny squares we received from all over the world, 25 countries and 49 states to be exact, and we actually ended up with 15,000. So we used the remaining 8,000 granny squares to make them into blankets for Skid Row. And that was, I think, my first experience in coordinating a large-scale collectively attributed work. We also conducted community workshops, and they were really great intergenerational workshops where you would have grandmas learning how to sew and crochet alongside their grandchildren who were 3 or 4. And for us, this was a way to bring craft into the public space and to think about the community building aspects of craft. The collective is still ongoing since I left it about 2 years ago. This is another example of a project we did at a historic market in downtown Los Angeles. And that was to think about the changing nature of downtown LA through the iconography of a Greek polis, right? So what it means to have public space in downtown, in historic downtown, and what are the icons, or what is the iconography of downtown LA? I also did my graduate work at Otis College of Art and Design with performance artist Suzanne Lacey. Around that time, I started working at the Metropolitan Transit Authority in their public art program, overseeing the maintenance of artwork such as this piece at the North Hollywood station, and also I totaled my car. So I was thinking public transit all the time and thinking about transit as a form of public space and public interaction. And then what happened, of course, was I got sexually harassed a lot on transit. And working in the signage department, the art and signage department, I saw that there wasn't a lot of signage that dealt with sexual harassment. There was just this little brochure that said, "Tell the driver if you were great." So what I did while I was working in that department was I appropriated their logo and their typography and their graphic design to create my own signs to go on public transportation. So every time that I took the bus into work, which was like 3 times a week, I would put up these signs on buses in Los Angeles. And so over the course of 4 months, I put up about 70 signs on different buses. And I got tired of doing this. I didn't really know if it would have a deep impact. So I just stopped, I just got tired of it. But then, oh no, this slide isn't good. Well, okay, I'm just gonna read this slide to you. But then one day I was making Xeroxes at my work, and I found an old customer satisfaction survey from before I started my project and a customer satisfaction survey from after I kind of finished putting up those signs. So most of the questions are the same with one key difference, which is question number 9. So on the survey after I had initiated my projects, it says, in the past 6 months when riding Metro, have you experienced any unwanted sexual behavior, including but not limited to touching, exposure, or inappropriate comments? 22% of respondents responded yes. And when you think about the fact that there's a 50-50 split in gender when it comes to ridership, and that sexual harassment predominantly happens to women or female identifying individuals, that means that almost half of female identified individuals experienced harassment on transit according to the survey. You can compare that
with question 9 on the spring 2013 survey, which says, I am proud to travel with Metro. So I started noticing this change internally in my workplace. And then a few months after, Metro actually partnered with Peace Over Violence, which is a local domestic violence agency, on creating a campaign about sexual harassment that was an online PSA, it was audio announcements in the train system, and it was actual advertising about sexual harassment. So even though most of my work is typically very public facing and very much about community building, and I think taking community building as my theory of social change, I think that this is a dramatically different theory of social change, right? This is about social change when you're anonymous, and this is about intervention into systems as social change and disrupting systems, which I go back and forth with doing nowadays. So around that same time, I applied to present about my work as a publicly engaged artist at Open Engagement, which is a conference on socially engaged art, and I got rejected from the conference. And while I was rejected, I started looking at the list of presenters and thinking, you know, all these presenters seem really white. So a group of my peers and I actually ended up researching the demographics of presenters at the 2014 Open Engagement Conference and guerrilla distributing a printed postcard at that conference with the demographics. And the way it broke down was the presenters at that time were 72% white, 16% Latino, 7% Black, 4% API, and 1% Middle Eastern. And for us, this is a huge topic of concern because socially engaged art typically takes as its premise, I mean, there's an interventionist premise, right, like with the Metro project, but it also takes as its premise working with communities that are disenfranchised. And those communities are often communities of color. So what does it say? That we're starting to build a discourse and a power structure of socially engaged art and funding, but we're once again seeing white artists at the top of that discourse. So this was the initiation of the Michelada think tank. I am happy to say that the year after, Open Engagement actually started self-tallying their demographics. They went down to, I think, about a 65% white presenter rate. It was 55% in Oakland last year, and I am hopeful for this year in Chicago. So we took this form of the tally to look at other arts institutions, right? And to really start to visualize data about racial equity in the arts. So where I did my undergrad, this was a tally of the faculty at Otis College of Art and Design. And we were actually commissioned to do a presentation in the lobby, and when we put up this tally, we were asked to take it down immediately and have several meetings with the dean. And for us, this is about thinking about the ways in which inequity manifests at different points of the art ecosystem, right? Where you can talk about a conference being inequitable, but then you can also talk about art schools being incredibly inequitable, and how does that influence the students who want to attend art school, right? How does that affect the work that students want to make? How does that affect the access of students after they leave art school and want to enter the art world? So as Michelada Think Tank, our work is about institutional critique, but it is also about building grassroots power. So we are currently in 4 different cities, Los Angeles, San Diego, Brooklyn, and Dallas. And we convene groups of artists in each city to talk about cultural equity issues in their own city and to catalyze the creation of additional support structures. So one example would be the LA POC Only Artist Network, which is a network that people can share calls for art, resources, funding, etc. That's something that emerged out of one of our think tanks. Our think tanks are about both engaging grassroots and institutional actors. So this is an example of a think tank in which institutional actors were asked to participate in a privilege walk with artists, and to really think about the divide in access between people who are institutional actors in the art community and people who are artists, especially in the Dallas community when artists don't have a lot of institutional access. So this is just a nice map of where we all are, and we like to think about the regionalization of micheladas and the many different forms of micheladas as akin to the regionalization of culture, right? Where it has been our great pleasure to work in these different cities and convene groups of heavily diverse artists within diverse city contexts, but then also see that a lot of them have very similar issues when it comes to cultural equity. So we're also looking at how cultural equity plays into the larger cultural planning of the city. So right now we are working on the cultural plan in New York City, as well as the cultural plan in Dallas. So I moved back to Texas about 2 years ago to take on a gig as the project manager of Translation Bakery Meadow up in Dallas. And this was Rick Lowe's project. He was commissioned by the Nasher Sculpture Center to do a public project in this neighborhood that is unique for being a Section 8 neighborhood, a predominantly black and brown neighborhood that was targeted for refugee resettlement in the early 90s. So it's now become this neighborhood where there are a lot of different cultures, a lot of different tensions, a lot of different barriers, but also an extraordinary amount of cultural richness. So Rick originally conceived Translation as a series of 6 outdoor markets that would showcase the work of neighborhood artisans and also provide a gathering space for community members. So this is an image from one of their talent shows that they did in the summer when he was working. When I came onto Translation, it had morphed into this storefront where people were programming it and teaching classes and hosting events out of this storefront. So now using the storefront as site, we're a location for cultural organizing and community building in the neighborhood. So a couple things that we do at Translation: we offer arts education. We hire people from within the community to showcase their capacities. Oftentimes people are highly trained from their home countries or just have some amazing talent that they develop by themselves but don't have a platform for that. So we provide a paid platform for weekly arts education. And right now we have about 8 community leaders who lead 15 to 20 hours of weekly programming. Another aspect of the work that we do is think about the function, the relationship between culture, assimilation, and appropriation, right? Because all of that is bound to happen when you have a community with 40 different languages spoken and several different cultures. So what we do is we make space for forms of culture that are usually suppressed or not expressed in this context, but at the same time we don't really restrict that culture to an essentialized understanding of you need to show up in your ethnic dress and serve us your ethnic food. Speaking of ethnic food, the average median income in the neighborhood is $15,000 for a family of approximately 4. So when you're working in a neighborhood like this, and when you're receiving money to work in a neighborhood like this, financial equity needs to be a consideration. That's why we pay the residents who teach out of our center. And another way that we try to achieve financial equity is through our social enterprise program. We have 2 branches of the social enterprise program. One branch connects artisans to local markets, and the other branch trains home chefs to become professionally certified food managers and to cater vendor food. So since we started in October 2015, we have been able to generate over $10,000 in income for our community chefs. And we always say that, as an arts organization, it's not our job to solve all the economic development problems in the neighborhood, but it is important to be conscious and responsible. And where we see ourselves fitting into that economic development story is in the area of supplemental income. So we don't, I mean, I'm not even on full-time, salary, right? So we can't offer that 40-hour-a-week salary that people need in order to survive, but what we do is we offer vital supplemental income, often for people who wouldn't be working otherwise. When Rick initiated translation, he also worked with architecture firms to build 3 white cubes. They were areas for public art in the community that eventually became locked up because people were not misusing them and not programming them. So what we did last year was we kickstarted a public art program where we hired teams from the neighborhood to create public art for these white cubes. So one of our first murals that we created is called Education is Not a Crime. It is about the reason that people of the Baha'i faith have left Iran. So it was initiated by this group here. They're a group of Baha'is, some of them are Iranian, and they left because their family and friends have gotten imprisoned and sometimes killed for accessing secondary education and jobs and journalism in Iran. So, we try to balance. I think that in Big Green Meadow, there are so many global issues, and for us, we try to be a platform for those global issues, and we also try to find the intersections between those issues, right? So instead of having these different cultures in a silo, how do we look at culture and also look at the intersection of culture? Part of our work in really telling the story of the neighborhood has to do with our media program. So this is Afrah Alakali. She used to work for the Ministry of Human Rights in Yemen, and she had her own radio station in Yemen. When she came to the US on a human rights conference 2 years ago, the Houthi militia occupation of Yemen happened and the borders were closed. So she could not go back to Yemen, and instead she was in Dallas seeking asylum. So she started working with us because of her radio background. She's been doing stories and profiles of the neighborhood in both Arabic and English, and also working on raising awareness within the United States human rights community about awareness of the situation in Yemen. So once again, this is a way in which we try to provide a platform, but also need to be creative in doing so, because, for example, I don't speak Arabic, but a portion of our community does. So for us, accessibility means that we need to actually depend upon and empower community leaders to go out and make that change in their own communities. And lastly, we partner with a host of organizations. One particular organization that we partner with is an urban gardening organization that built backyard gardens that we're now using to develop a food security program for the neighborhood. And possibly link it to our social enterprise program as well. So in terms of this fellowship, one thing people always ask me when I tell people about my work, which I think is very collective in nature and very organizing based in nature, is they go, but like, do you make things? But like, what do you make? What are you into? And this has been more of an issue for the past 2 years since I've been managing translation and really taking a step back to let our community leaders shine. So the only 2 pieces of physical works that I made while I was at translation were during my winter residency at the Women's Center for Creative Work this past winter. This particular piece is about the relationship between policing and gentrification in the neighborhood. So for 18 months, I would just photograph police cars in Big Green Meadow, which is 3 square miles, by the way, whenever I saw them. And this is just a small fraction of the police that's in our neighborhood every day. but our local business improvement district spends $250,000 on hiring additional private patrol in our neighborhood. That patrol often disproportionately targets Black residents, Spanish-speaking residents, and homeless residents. And for me, it's a connection between, the money that the bid brings in, the policing of the neighborhood, and this precarity of the neighborhood when it comes to housing prices and displacement. Another piece I made while at the Women's Center for Creative Work was really thinking about my own personal migration history as an artist, right? But then thinking, because when I first moved to Dallas, I thought to myself, oh my God, these apartments are $700. Like, that's amazing. You're never gonna get an apartment like that in LA. And then, of course, that was not the case for my friends in Texas who were getting priced out of their $700 apartments, right? And a lot of the conversations that I've had about displacement and housing and the arts have been on the hyper-localized level. And for me, as someone who is between two different art communities, who I would say has investments in two different states, I'm really interested in how we can start to articulate macro or regional relationships. So that leads me to what I'm investigating during the course of my fellowship, which is thinking about these regional relationships, right? And the sort of paradox of how can a progressive paradise all of a sudden not be a place for the poor? So this is a recent study that says California exports all of its poor to Texas, right? We have a heavily blue state exporting all of its poor to a heavily red state. Like, what is the cause of that? How do we start to tease out that contradiction? And how do we also tease out the fact that a lot of these places that are being, treated as desolate, empty places for people from big cities to be pioneers in, and I'm kind of guilty of this too, right? How do we deal with the fact that all of these redevelopments of artsy enclaves and cities are starting to be described with language in relationship to New York, or in relationship to Brooklyn, right? So this was an article that came out in the Texas Highways magazine about Oak Cliff, a neighborhood of Dallas. Oh, and that's how I feel. And I think when we think about when we talk about displacement, the language that we have and the models that we have are simultaneously inadequate and based on these coastal regions. So when I think about artist collectives and projects that have been highlighted, that have gained a lot of traction for their work, once again, they're dealing with these coastally situated cities, right? So you have the Chinatown Art Brigade in New York City, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project in San Francisco, Defend Boyle Heights in LA, and Community Futures Lab in Philadelphia. But how do we start to have this understanding, this contextual understanding, once again, of moving inwards from the coast? So my research this year is based on the few premises. One is that New York City ruins everything. Two is that the current discourse about the relationship between artists, creative placemaking, and gentrification originates largely from established art centers such as New York City and LA, but that there's a need to consider non-New York and LA relationships between creative placemaking and gentrification, as well as the role of the displacement of people in capital from NYC or LA to up-and-coming art cities. So what does it mean for a city like Dallas, which I think is starting to gain a lot of cultural capital, actually, in terms of its arts fairs? They just announced Arts Month of April, and the mayor of Dallas is known as an arts mayor, right? How does that also relate to the amounts of capital that are poured into Dallas and are remaking Dallas, probably uncritically, in desiring to be this cultural city? And how do we understand place and context as informing the poetics, but also the politics of this work? So, three very different places. So the cities that I'm looking at are determined by established migration patterns and also cultural capital. So we have the sort of cultural centers in New York, San Francisco, and LA, but then also their migration patterns between California and Texas to Dallas, Austin, and Houston, and then also migration patterns to Detroit and Philadelphia. And for me, I would say that this doesn't even begin to cover the scope of what's being overlooked, right? When we only look at large metropolitan areas, when we look at the biggest cities in Texas, that doesn't even cover the relationship of Dallas to Waxahachie, right? But this is the beginning of a methodology that I would like to see decentering what we understand as the conversation around art and music change. So what I would really like to create is either a web or print survey of artists who are working on this issue between art and creative placemaking and gentrification that creates the network of collaboration. And Project Row Houses and University of Houston can be one of the vital hubs in thinking about how we have equitable arts-based community redevelopment. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this.
Questions?
Yes.
Will you elaborate on New York ruins everything?
There's so many reasons it ruins everything. But I think the reason I'm thinking is that it is always, or not, it has self-consciously positioned itself as the center of artistic life, political life, and economic life. Right, in a way where I think that when you think about calling something the Brooklyn of Texas, right, or the Brooklyn of Los Angeles, that really dilutes the unique place-based characteristics of, say, those neighborhoods, and only makes it something relative to what's going on from New York City. And for me, I'm not really interested right now in, I think, major metropolitan areas being a center of cultural discourse that we're all kind of relating to. I am interested in thinking about what is a more equitable relationship.
Will some of this data sort of become a kind of mapping project that will have a kind of visual expression of some sort? I mean, in other words, the question is really, what's your hunch as to how this might look?
Got it. So I see this as a platform for artist projects, and I'm interested in artist projects, that are on the ground and artists that are telling their own stories. So I see this as a series of artist interviews, either visual or written, and then potentially inviting those artists to do collaborations. Yes.
So how much bleed outside of these, you've got Houston, Austin, Dallas, which are, at least Houston and Dallas are still very large cities and known cultural centers. And so I'm thinking about how much bleed outside of those cities and the communities around it, which are much smaller, and maybe don't have a lot. I'm thinking about this particularly in relation to as NEA funding is threatened. Of course, we're thinking about it from our perspective as a big city, but I keep seeing coverage that where it really will be felt is in smaller cities, because there's a mandate that NEA gives money to every congressional district in the country. So are you thinking about that? Can't imagine that you actually have the resources within the year to go very far outside of the city. Are you really looking within these urban centers? Or are you going to be looking into Waco or somewhere outside of these places?
No, I think that's an extraordinarily good point. I think that's something that I would like to do. I do not know if I have the resource or capacity to do so. Yeah, but I think that is an extraordinarily good point, because I think that we can look at, I remember I have a friend, we can look at Dallas as kind of being a secondary city to a larger metropolitan area, but I have a friend for whom Dallas is the largest place that he's ever lived, and that's his idea of making it, right? So I think, yeah, it's important to think about these nuanced local relationships, for sure.
Can you also talk maybe a little bit about, working at Vickery Meadows and the relationship with the people that you work with there being displaced from their home countries, and then also then to the shift to artists and the wider maybe swath of how displacement of artists also then ends up impacting people in the neighborhoods of these cities as well who are not artists. Are you thinking about all of that, like connecting the dots?
Wait, are those two, is one question about
Yeah.
Vickery Meadow and the other question about artists, or is it artists and Vickery Meadow?
The question is more like the impact of the displacement of artists as a factor in the displacement of other people. One example being people that you work with at Vickery Meadows who are also.
Absolutely. I think that there has been an enormous debate about whether or not, I think, branding a neighborhood as cultural, right, or branding a neighborhood as artistic, and you could even go so far as to say branding a city as cultural or artistic. I think there is an incredible debate about how that has a relationship to people who have lived and worked in the community for years. So for me, this is a huge concern in Dallas. You see it happening with Oak Cliff and Bellum, and you're starting to see it happen with Trinity Grove in West Dallas as well. And for me, because I have an expansive way of the way that artists work, I think that art can work as resistance. So I am interested in people who identify as cultural workers, but also identify as resistors of this phenomenon.
And that would be like the people that you're asking for in agreement with them.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that would
okay.
be Community Futures Lab, for example. I think they're like a brass recipient, they're culture workers, but they're also culture workers on the side against displacement. But I think you can also have culture workers, obviously, who are not self-conscious or perhaps are self-conscious and do not feel responsible.
So are there questions or resources that you would like or need from the people here or our networks in order to help you?
Not at this particular moment. I'm sure I'll have many more. Yeah.
Any questions? So I think that this is also clear that this is the first, this is one of the other public opportunities in order to engage Carol and our fellows in these questions and conversations. There are other opportunities that we are going to create in public forums, as well as opportunities in order for you to be talking to Carol and Carrie on a different basis and just check in with them and see how things are going. We are also developing a community, basically a sounding board or a community board in order to help them and ground brain trust that grounds their work in this community, and we're bringing people together in order to help support them in that manner. And we have ideas of who that is, but if you all have ideas of who that could be, don't forget to suggest that or share that with us. Any other questions for Carol for right now? Because of course there are more. There's a little more time, but otherwise we can take a short break. I'm sorry.
Well, I just comment. I really enjoyed your presentation, and it made me think about the Menil family and the way that they saw themselves as sort of creating culture in Houston as a site, and so they were sending for artists from New York. And so I wonder if you.
So that's an important issue that happens in Dallas too, and I would say that in our work as Micheladas think tank, when we've been to San Diego or when we've been to Pittsburgh, we actually hear the same complaints over and over, which is there's a tendency to import artists. There's not a tendency to grow and invest in local artists. How do we stop seeing ourselves as secondary, right?
Yeah, it's multiple generations of a narrative about how to produce a cultural site. But the archive at the Menil might be an interesting place to
No,
just
that would be great.
poke around.
Great. I mean, I guess my ask would just be context on Houston. So,
That's one.
yeah,
One
I'm
narrative
learning so
about-
much.
But I mean, it's interesting, there are people in the room who can tell you that's an interesting narrative to juxtapose to the contemporary narrative, how this becomes a rights city.
Yeah.
Just, I may be the only one, just to help me for clarity's sake, if you could summarize again one more time, this last part of what you hope to do here. You're critical of artists coming from other places to these others, to especially New York. I'm a little confused on the sort of key core theme through the project. What are you critical of?
So the core theme is the relationship between identifying a neighborhood as a cultural neighborhood, usually with the assistance and presence of artists, and then also the subsequent development of that neighborhood and displacement of working class to poor communities of color, as you know, the classic like gentrification narrative, right? But to complicate that narrative, how do we look at it from a regional perspective? So how do we look at relative migrations between California and Texas, or New York, California, New York, Michigan? How do we look at cities themselves and the displacement and migration from cities?
But displacement across all kind of economic class factors, you're not just talking about artists?
No, not just artists. Yeah, so actually there's oh no, I took out the Forbes map. All right, so there was a Forbes map that was which are the cities that people are moving to currently, based on economic opportunity, based on housing prices, and so the city selection was also based on that map and looking at larger migration trends.
Great image to end on. Okay, so we're going to take a bit of a break. Thank you very much.